My name's Tim Williams. I work at Argonne, and I'm funded at 50% by the ALCF. And this talk is going to give a survey of the state of the world of the applications that have been getting ready for Aurora and those that are on Aurora for its first year of production now. And talk a little bit about the range of science and numerical methods and discuss some of the programming approaches for the system and and survey the choices that were made. I think I hope that one thing you might take from this is that if you have an application that hasn't been developed for this system or a system like this system, that given the wide range of successes, I think there's reason to expect it could be developed for Aurora. So just for your information, mostly, this is the Aurora system in sort of overall statistics. It has 10,624 nodes. I'll say more about the node architecture in just a moment. These are all connected by a Cray HPE slingshot network with a dragonfly topology. The other facts and figures on the right, one thing to note is the goal for the system was to achieve at least 1 exaflops in FP64 performance. If you look at just the hardware peak numbers and frequencies and all that, in principle, it could do on the order of 2 exaflops. The only thing I'll call out about from this slide is the storage system, which it's still a bit under development. Some bugs are still being worked out, but it is innovative in the sense that it's not a block-based file system, but rather an object store called Deos, which, because it is not constrained by the limitations of block-based file access, can achieve extremely high performance and has already sort of easily topped the IO 500 list a couple of times. As I mentioned, the system is now in production, starting as of January 27th of this year. And in November of last year, on the most recent top 500 list, Aurora landed at number 3 on the main 64-bit HPL benchmark, and that's using 9,234 nodes, so not using all the nodes on the system. Also, interestingly, it remains at number 1 in this HPL mixed precision benchmark, which is meant to be a rough proxy for AI operations at over 11 exaflops. As promised, here's the node architecture. For those that aren't familiar, the node is dual socket for CPUs. It has 2 of these officially branded Intel Xeon CPU Max Series processors, generally known as Sapphire Rapids. These are the ones that have 64 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory on package. They also each have 512 gigs of DRAM. These are connected via a UPI in a normal dual socket NUMA configuration. The compute power is really in these 6 Intel GPUs. These are officially titled Intel Data Center GPU Max Series, which is the last time I'll say that lengthy phrase, and refer to them henceforth as PVC or Ponte Vecchio. These each have 128 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory. They're connected all to all with Intel's Xe-Link fabric. And the rest of the node is wired up with PCIe. More lanes than are apparent here, and it makes use of these PCIe switches to send data to the network interface cards. These are these HPE Cray Cassini NICs, each capable of 200 gigabits per second bidirectional. One point to note, if you compare this node with the Frontier node, so that's the sort of peer exascale system at OLCF, the Frontier uh, supercomputer. Um, the most obvious thing to note is the difference in brands of the GPUs, AMD on the Frontier system versus Intel on ours. Uh, the CPU difference is probably less consequential for most of the applications. But one thing to note is the Aurora system has a higher ratio of um, NICs to GPUs, and they're exactly the same NICs. So that means as you scale out to significantly larger numbers of nodes, in principle, you should be able to get better scaling with the Aurora. The other thing to note about then, and particularly in comparison with the two pre-exascale systems at these facilities, Summit and Polaris, is the distinct lack of NVIDIA GPUs, which both of these systems and many of the scientific supercomputing systems have had for some time. The consequences of that are something that have been uh, a primary area of activity and apps development for both Frontier and Aurora. I'll touch on that a little bit. So to prepare applications in advance of the system, we took advantage of two programs. One is the Department of Energy-wide exascale computing project, which was a gigantic project, very well funded, ran for 7 years, ended at the end of 23. Um, and an unusual move for Oscar, the DOE office that managed it. They actually funded application development. Um, and there were 21 of these AD projects that had significant time and funding to do whatever they needed to get these applications ready for exascale, and that included everything up to completely redeveloping the application from scratch. The other program is the Aurora Early Science Program, which Venkat Vishwanath and I manage for ALCF. This is there's a companion program at OLCF called CAR, if you're familiar with that. This is our own applications readiness program where we competitively selected 19 projects and have been engaged with them for quite a few years now, years than intended, given the delays of the Aurora delivery. But that project was funded through the project to build the Aurora system and was able to support 16 postdocs to work with the teams and partially support those of us on the computational science side as points of contact to work with them. We were lucky to have the Intel Argonne Center of Excellence. So this is 5 full-time Intel staff, or at least it has been for the past 5 years or so, who are dedicated to working across all of these projects and with us at ALCF um, on on all aspects of getting applications ready and software ready on the system. Through that organization and other means, we've supported many hackathons and dungeon sessions and workshops. You can see 6 different workshops here represented by group photos and with the obvious transition to pandemic time here in the middle where it turns into Zoom photos. So of all the projects, the ones I'm most familiar with and could answer the most questions about probably are the early science projects. One of the things that we did, which was a luxury not afforded to the ECP program because it started earlier than sort of the most aggressive exponential ramp up of AI and data in scientific computing. We were able to have a special call for proposals to explicitly bring in projects that had significant components of data intensive computing and AI or machine learning, along with a number of traditional modeling and simulation projects. Um, I won't say much about, so that's in support of the new mission of the LCF to support these so-called 3 pillars, simulation, data, and learning as peers at exascale. I won't say much about the simulation side, just call out that this figure there is from a um, classical molecular dynamics simulation with a machine learned force field of photo switching of a fermion lattice, basically. Um, and these calculations are done in collaboration with an experimental program at USC that fabricates layered functional nanomaterials whose functions are activated by lasers. Uh, in the data pillar, we were lucky to have representation of a lot of different kinds of data. Everything from um, tokamak experimental probe data to observational data from cosmology sky surveys, um, use of in situ data for machine learning model training and in situ other kinds of in situ analysis. For example, in a project that does a lattice Boltzmann CFD simulation of a realistic human circulatory system, and coupled with finite elements to model transport of tumor cells through the circulatory system to study metastasis in cancer. So that project does a lot of on-the-fly, in situ visualization and data analysis, including time-dependent visualization, and you can look into a little window of time as it runs. The data in the figure there, this is a computer regeneration of the neuron neurons and connections from a sample of brain tissue. So the data in this project comes from high throughput electron microscopy, where you start with a small cube of brain tissue, and the automated lab system slices it up and pipelines it through an electron microscope and produces lots and lots of images of sections of the 3D data. In the AI pillar, I think it's fair to say that the projects span a number of different network topologies, different kinds of models, um, transformers, recurrent neural networks, and what's shown in the figure is a transformer model that acts on molecular data in this SMILES format, and it's part of a wholly AI-based project that includes the use of natural language processing and large language models to do cancer drug design. There's a generative model that is trained by a running lattice QCD simulation. And the model, once trained, can then be used to accelerate further lattice QCD calculations to enable either running the same simulation faster or a larger simulation on an exascale system. And roughly speaking, it does that by more efficiently Monte Carlo sampling, which is at the heart of the method. Um, there's a range of, as you might expect, there's large scale training involved. That's one way you get to exascale with AI. The tokamak experimental data is a lot of data, and the training of the model is the exascale calculation for that project. The model itself, once trained, is lightweight and can be embedded in the experimental control system of a tokamak. The model is trained to predict the onset of plasma instabilities in real time, far enough in advance, by some tens of milliseconds, I believe is the goal, so that when one is anticipated, mitigating controls can be enacted. At the other end of the spectrum, if we go back to this brain tissue project, there is a neural network, a flood fill network, that is trained on Aurora from this data. But the vast majority of the exascale calculation is a massive inference pipeline. So all of this image data is coming through this inference pipeline running this flood fill network and producing the 3D connectome of the neural tissue. So we now have, or we know specifically what the first year science projects are on Aurora, and those come from these three different programs here. One is the early science program I just talked about. Um, Another is the primary insight program, which most of you are probably familiar with, but it's the one that's open to the scientific world. It's very competitive, but gives very large grants to do capability computing, meaning computing that could not be done on a smaller machine or a typical machine. The ALCC program targets specifically DOE research. It's run by the Oscar in collaboration with the other DOE research offices from Office of Science. And we have 13 projects for the first half of this year. In terms of scope of allocations, we have 5 million Aurora node hours awarded to those, over 22 million awarded to Insight, and about 20 million awarded to the early science projects. Insight, we have 30 projects. Typically, when a system is new, you have more projects at the LCFs, and as people grow into the system, they need bigger portions of it, and the number of projects declines. We also have 4 projects with small allocations for doing development with an idea to do calculations in subsequent years. So this diagram here is my own categorization of the numerical methods or computational science motifs that are represented across these year 1 projects. And the reason at the outset I said if you have a type of calculation that you are doing, there's reason to hope that it could be implemented on Aurora or the other exascale systems. We have projects that have implemented molecular dynamics of a variety of flavors, including ensemble methods not shown here, reactive classical quantum, a full range of quantum chemistry methods, everything from Hartree-Fock through, high order perturbation theory, GW methods, and high accuracy quantum Monte Carlo methods, and everything in between. And these are, with maybe one exception, all deployed in one part or another of one of these projects. In what I've labeled as particle methods, we've got a strong implementation of Monte Carlo transport, neutral particle transport, P3M cosmology simulation for dark matter gravity simulation, plasma particle and cell. In CFD, again, I partly by deliberate choice in the early science program to get a wide spectrum, and through just the normal spectrum of people that apply for production allocations, we've got a lot of methods, lattice Boltzmann's, particle hydrodynamics, spectral element. We have AMR, structured meshes, unstructured meshes. It's getting down into niche areas that are not represented here. And in the AI space, it's hard to do justice to it. As I said before, lots of different network topologies, different approaches, Gaussian process approaches, and others, different approaches to training and hyperparameter tuning. There's a specific large language model called Aurora GPT, which aims to be a foundation model for science. So that was the first year projects from those 3 programs I mentioned. As I said, there was a lot of effort under ECP to develop applications for Aurora. So just to see how much of an overlap there is under this kind of categorization, these blue methods are new ones that are found in those 15 ECP applications projects. that are not represented in any of the year one projects on Aurora. So I think the takeaway from this is there's even more that can run on Aurora, but there's a lot of overlap between the ECP applications and the insight and early science applications. The next couple of slides are a little bit more refined categorization of science domains than just physics and chemistry and material science. I won't murder you by reading every one of these, but just call out that these are sort of organized by area, by color, and grouping. Sort of here are engineering and CFD, fusion energy, what I classify as computer science, astrophysics, material science, high energy physics, chemistry, biology and biophysics, and earth science. Here, if we also consider those 15 ECP projects, really the only other science domain that's not represented in the first year on Aurora is seismic wave propagation. For those of you who are more steeped in the applications space and know more of the work that goes on in the wider computational science community, this lists applications or workflow components that are part of all of these projects, the first year projects on Aurora and those 15 ECP projects. So if it's on this list, it has been ported and verified to run on Aurora. All right, so those have all been ported and verified to run. I'll just say a little bit about performance in a kind of high level way. First off, something about what the expectations were. In ECP, as you may know, the applications projects, or at least a substantial percentage of them, had these so-called KPP1 targets for performance. And what that meant was to demonstrate a performance improvement of 50x versus running the same calculation on a system of the vintage of the beginning of ECP, which for those of you who are also old, you may remember that this was around 2017, the era of systems on the order of 20 petaflops. The performance metric is a figure of merit that was defined by the applications teams themselves. So it was one that was designed to make sense for the domain and maybe would be something understandable by other practitioners in the same computational science domain. Because of the timing of the end of the ECP and the availability of the Aurora system not working out in the right order, there was limited availability before the end of ECP for these projects to try to measure these figures of merit on Aurora, but a few did, and those that did had good success. The Exalt application here, this was an OpenMC science case running their challenge problem on 1,024 nodes of Aurora, so on the order of a tenth of the system, and even at that was able to achieve nearly 90x, well over this 50x target. XSMR, I'm sorry, Exalt, I've got them backwards. Exalt was a LAMMPS calculation with SNAP, and XSMR is the OpenMC challenge problem, electronics, and they ran on half that many nodes and were able to achieve nearly an 85x performance improvement. ExaSky is the CRK HEC application doing coupled gravity, dark matter gravity plus smooth particle hydrodynamics, hydro for baryons. And that ran on more nodes, 4,096 nodes, and was able to achieve over 275x on that metric comparison. The early science program, because part of the the mission of that is to make sure we have at least some applications and projects that are ready to become production users on the system. Takes a different view. It's evaluated more the way that a production application would be evaluated. And what happens when you apply for an insight project, there's a science panels are convened and there's a major scientific merit review. But a companion to that is done by the facilities ourselves, which is traditionally called a computational readiness review. Um, and the goal of that is to make sure that these projects really need leadership class computing and capability computing on these big systems. So um, the measure of you must be this tall to run, I guess, is you're expected to run your science case for insight on at least 20% of the nodes of the full system. You're also expected to make, good use of the hardware, which for GPU accelerated systems, when you review computational readiness, that means you better be offloading to the GPUs all of the numerically intensive kernels that need to be. And finally, you have to be ready to run if you're given one of these insight grants. So that's the third component. So the problem with this when you're developing toward a new system is you don't have a system that you can demonstrate this on. And until Frontier, there wasn't even a peer system you could demonstrate this on. So what we did for early science was wait until last fall and asked all of these projects to generate some scaling plots and discuss offloading of kernels to the PVCs on Aurora and otherwise, assess, demonstrate their readiness. And we did find, based on an internal and external review that, 16 of those 19 projects was concurred among all the reviewers were clearly ready. Another way we looked at performance was more at the micro scale. And this was organized through the Aurora Applications Working Group that Chris Knight and Scott Parker led. And what this group did was for several years in the run-up to Aurora, every quarter we sent out a somewhat annoying survey to all of these projects under the ECP and ESP programs and asked them a bunch of questions. Especially at the beginning, a lot of it was, are you porting to a programming model supported by Aurora, or have you already ported? Do you have all of the science components implemented that you need to run your proposed science case or your ECP challenge problem? And the other thing we did, I think, from this micro performance perspective, was to ask all of these projects to define a single GPU performance figure of merit. And our expectations there were kind of based on peer GPU systems. So we based looking just at the hardware capabilities, one would reasonably expect that the PVC system on GPU on Aurora compared to the AMD MI250X GPU on Frontier should be able to achieve, rough parity in performance. The PVC system compared to sort of earlier technology like the NVIDIA A100 we have in Polaris should do somewhat better than parity. There's a huge software factor in here. The NVIDIA software is more mature and other um, I think is the simplest way to say it. So that improves performance there relative to other GPUs in some cases. But the figures you see here, I haven't, they're anonymized. I'm not listing the individual application components, but they are the application components for offload to GPUs that were a part of all of those ESP and ECP projects. This is a snapshot of data we were able to get from those projects who were able to run on these other kinds of GPUs as of about 1 year ago. And at that point, we had convinced ourselves anyway that we sort of were meeting this reasonable expectation of parity with the MI250X and exceeding performance of the A100. Now I'll transition to a little bit about how the project's programmed toward Aurora and to the other exascale systems. I think it's important to point out that essentially all of these projects are interested in portability across all of the exascale systems, which today in the US means um, AMD and Intel GPU accelerated systems, but also the pre-exascale and probable future systems that have NVIDIA GPU accelerators. Um, when we look at the, the data intensive computing and to an even greater extent, the AI or machine learning application components across these projects and across the community in general, I think that there's they have an advantage versus traditional um, HPC for simulate modeling and simulation, and that is twofold. One is that the community, the programming community, really does have a significant amount of consensus on a Python ecosystem and a significant amount of use of fairly high level deep learning frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlow and associated technologies for hyperparameter training and things. Um, and the vendors of the GPU hardware, uh, not at all because of the interest of us in scientific computing, but because of the giant financial market in the AI space, are obliged to develop and provide for free, if you buy their hardware, um, efficient implementations of these high-level frameworks and the lower-level supporting infrastructure that offload with high performance to their GPUs. Um, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying it, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's not to say that it was, easy for these AI and data intensive projects to get all this stuff to work on Aurora and on Frontier. There was a lot of back and forth and working with the developers of the implementations with Intel on the Aurora system, and our data science team did a lot of work putting together Conda environments and other guidance that you can find from this link in our documentation. But the advantages of to that community, I think, are clear. If we go to the more traditional HPC simulation community, things are, still somewhat messy, and there isn't the same sort of lingua franca approach. With the exception, I would argue on the CPU side, where the use of threads, typically OpenMP and SIMD vectorization um, uh, type directives and programming are pretty well established and portable. Likewise, the communication layer of MPI is a sort of shining example of community consensus for a long time now. When we start talking about offloading to the GPU, things branch a lot. One approach one could take, and which was advocated by some, is the high-level approach of using the language standard in the higher versions of OpenMP, the target directives to offload to GPU. And many of these projects did take that approach. If you are not going to go that route, then you need some other means of programming offloaded GPU kernels. And here is where the vendors are sort of less inclined to support the community standards than in the AI space. Historically, on the Summit and Polaris and Perlmutter systems, because people have been programming NVIDIA GPUs for longer for science, there's a lot of established work done in CUDA, and NVIDIA is quite happy with that, and their motivation there is for everyone to program in CUDA and not worry about the other systems. AMD, on the other hand, has their HIP programming model, which is as close as one could legally get probably to a clone of CUDA with a string replace. It has some differences. The but that was their their pitch is, bring in your CUDA code, run it through our Hipify tool, which turns it into HIP, throw away your CUDA code, and then run HIP everywhere. In fact, you can run HIP everywhere. The HIP runs on NVIDIA GPUs through a program called ChipStar. There's an implementation of HIP that some Argonne people have been developing. You may have seen a webinar sometime recently that Brice Bidot gave on this. Intel, on the other hand, sort of the latest to arrive in this discrete GPU world, has picked up and is a strong advocate for SYCL. It is a community standard. It's been around for a while, but sort of got a giant boost by Intel when they built it in as part of their one API development system for this GPU and for other Intel devices. They wrote their own translation tool called Cyclomatic, which will ingest CUDA and output, nearly ready to run SYCL. So Intel's advocacy is to take your CUDA code, run it through Cyclomatic, clean it up, then throw away the CUDA and run SYCL everywhere. You can also do that. There are SYCL implementations for all of these architectures. There's also OpenCL, but there are very few people that use it, and I won't say more about it. The other approach one can take to avoid programming directly in one of these kernel programming languages, like CUDA, SYCL, and HIP, is to use an encapsulation layer, a higher level portability layer like Cocos or Raja or some of these other libraries. These, typically are implemented directly on top of whichever specific kernel programming language or model is optimal for the system. So you kind of get the advantages of the best tuned backend for that by taking that approach, which is one that I'm a big advocate of. And just to make it perfectly clear, these are sort of the common approaches one can take on Aurora. All that being said, I went through, sort of combed through all of these first year projects on Aurora and gathered a lot of data about them. And one of the things we looked at was the choices of programming models made across these projects. So the numbers here you see are what I call application workflow components. Some of these projects have multi-component workflows that include AI models and simulations, sometimes two different kinds of simulations. Some of the projects just have two different applications that they use to do independent but related calculations for a single science goal. So the numbers add up to that total number rather than the number of projects. As I pointed out before, I think there's a lot more convergence in the AI space. And I've sort of done it a little bit of a disservice here by putting it all into one piece of the pie. So this includes PyTorch and TensorFlow and all the different kinds of approaches to training and parameter optimization, et cetera. And the rest of it is a breakdown of the compiled language programming approaches that were chosen by these different projects. As I mentioned, there's a fair number of projects that went the route of the OpenMP target standard. All but one of the Fortran projects took this approach. But I think it's important to call out that two of the fairly hardcore C++ projects, OpenMC and QMCPack, took this approach as well. And people who are much better performance engineers than I have convinced me that there's really nothing, there's little that one can do with these other kernel programming approaches that one cannot do with OpenMP, given a fully functioning compiler and knowledge. SYCL is a big player, as you might expect, because the Aurora system, is from Intel. They advocate SYCL, but what's included in here are projects that have their own portability layer. It might be as simple as compiler compiler directives or ifdefs and or an internal library or separately compiled library layer. I didn't call out all of those here, but some of these are direct SYCL. Cocos is a big player as well. There are a lot of DOE codes, and it's popular there. Um, the portability layers that I've called out more explicitly here are some important players. Grid and CUDA are portability layers for Lattice QCD, developed by primarily the US QCD community. Those have SYCL implementations underneath them. One of them has both a SYCL and an OpenMP implementation. And the higher level Lattice QCD applications are written on top of these. The libseed came out of ECP. It's used in typically in CFD applications. Oka has a lot of projects because that's the sort of directives-based portability layer behind the NEC-RS spectral element application, which grew out of Argonne originally. So there's a lot of interest in that here, and a lot of particularly ALCC projects using that application. The rest I'll won't say anything specific about, but I'll just call out that if I now add in those ECP projects to the first year production and ESP projects, it doesn't change that much. The numbers tweak around here and there, but you see, for example, the appearance of one Raja application and a couple more HIP applications. And by and large, these HIP applications are using ChipStar. That's really all I wanted to say. I would like to, and maybe as part of getting more out of this data, would like to kind of tabulate how the programming models map to the different applications or application components. If I have time after the webinar, I'll try to put something like that into the back of the slide deck for reference. But that's all I wanted to say, and I'm happy to take any questions.